40 degrees below zero. Wind screaming across frozen earth at 60 miles per hour. No hills to block it. No forests to slow it. Just an endless, snow-scoured plain stretching to every horizon. This is the Central Asian steppe in winter. A place where exposed skin freezes in minutes. Where the cold doesn't creep, it strikes. Where survival, for most of human history, depended on one thing above all else: fire. And fire meant wood. But there is no wood here. The steppe is a grassland, a sea of earth and sky with almost nothing tall enough to cast a shadow, let alone burn through a winter night. The few trees that exist cling to distant riverbanks or huddle in scattered, jealously guarded groves. For a nomad following herds across hundreds of miles of open country, firewood isn't scarce. It's functionally absent. So here's the paradox. A landscape cold enough to kill in hours, inhabited for millennia by people who had nothing to burn. How did they survive? The answer isn't endurance. It isn't suffering through the cold or waiting for spring. The Mongol nomads didn't merely survive the steppe winter. They lived through it, raised families through it, built an empire through it. They did this without forests, without stone houses, without the fuel that every other cold climate civilization considered essential. They did it with a circle of felt, a pile of dung, and an understanding of their world so complete that the absence of trees became irrelevant. The Central Asian steppe is not one landscape. It's a category of landscapes, a belt of grassland stretching from Hungary to Manchuria, thousands of miles of nearly flat earth covered in tough, short grasses bred by wind and cold. In winter, it becomes something else entirely. The steppe sits at high altitude, much of it above 3,000 feet, with no mountain ranges to the north. When Arctic air masses descend from Siberia, nothing stops them. They pour south across open country, accelerating, gathering speed and bite. The temperature drops, then it drops further. -20 Celsius becomes routine. -40 is common. The wind doesn't gust. It howls without pause, a physical force that finds every gap in clothing, every crack in shelter, every place warmth tries to hide. The grass vanishes under snow. The ground freezes solid to a depth of several feet. Water turns to iron. Rivers stop moving. This is when most ecosystems go dormant. This is when most human activity, historically, retreated indoors, into log cabins, stone houses, dugouts, anything with thick walls and a roaring hearth fed by cords of stacked wood. But on the steppe, there are no walls, and there is no wood. The treelessness isn't partial, it's defining. The classic steppe is grassland by climate and soil. Enough rain to support dense ground cover, but not enough to sustain forests. Trees exist only in narrow ecological niches, riverbanks where roots can reach reliable water, north-facing slopes that collect extra moisture, small volcanic outcroppings that create local microclimates. These patches are isolated, sometimes miles apart, often dozens of miles apart. A herder moving livestock to winter pasture could travel for weeks and never see a tree large enough to burn. Even when trees existed, they weren't available. Riverside groves were controlled, often sacred, preserved because they were rare. Collecting wood from this wasn't a matter of walking into a forest with an axe. It required permission, negotiation, or ownership. For nomads who lived by mobility, who moved camps dozens of times a year following the grass their animals needed, relying on scarce, stationary resources, was a structural impossibility. The equation was simple and brutal. The steppe winter demanded fire, and the steppe itself provided nothing to burn. For sedentary peoples, the solution was to not be there. Farming cultures stayed south, where winters were milder or fuel was abundant. Northern forest tribes had timber. The steppe, in winter, was a barrier, a place you crossed quickly or avoided entirely. But the Mongols didn't avoid it. They lived there, year-round, in the coldest, most exposed months. And they did it without the resource other cold-adapted cultures built their entire survival systems around. That absence forced innovation. Not the frantic, desperate kind, but the deep, multi-generational kind. The slow accumulation of solutions that, together, formed something more sophisticated than a wood fire ever could. A system built not on fighting the steppe, but on listening to it. The gyr is a circle, not metaphorically, structurally. A perfect round footprint, walls curving without corner or seam, roof rising to a central point like a geometric expression of efficiency. That shape isn't aesthetic, it's physics. When wind hits a flat wall, it stops. All that moving air slams into an immovable surface, creating pressure, drag, turbulence. The structure has to resist. On the steppe, where 60-mile-per-hour gusts are routine and the wind doesn't stop for days, resistance means failure. Corners catch air, flat sides become sails. Right angles are structural weak points where force concentrates and materials tear. But wind doesn't hit a circle, it flows around it. The curved wall deflects the airstream smoothly along its surface, splitting it, rejoining it on the other side. No flat surfaces to catch, no corners to pry at. The gyr sits in the wind the way a stone sits in a river, immovable not because it resists the current, but because the current moves around it. That shape also solves another problem: stakes. A square tent needs them, driven deep into the ground at every corner to hold the structure taut against lateral forces. But steppe ground in winter is frozen solid, hard as concrete to a depth of several feet. Driving stakes is impossible. The gyr doesn't need them. Its walls are self-supporting, a collapsible wooden lattice called the kana. Sections of crisscrossed willow poles that accordion out into a circular frame. Roof poles, the uni, lean inward from the top of the lattice to a wooden ring at the apex, the tuno. Tension holds everything. Compression locks it. Gravity does the rest. The entire structure can be disassembled by two people in under an hour and loaded onto pack animals. When the pasture is exhausted or the weather shifts, the family moves. The gyr moves with them. But the frame is only the skeleton. The real genius is what covers it. Felt, specifically shiredak, thick panels of matted, sheep's wool pounded and compressed until the fibers lock together into a dense, semi-rigid textile. Not woven, felted. The difference matters. Woven fabric, no matter how tight, has gaps between threads where air moves freely. Felt is solid. The fibers tangle and mesh at the microscopic level, creating millions of tiny air pockets throughout the material. Those pockets trap air, and trapped air is insulation. A gyr is covered in multiple layers of felt, 2, sometimes 3 overlapping panels on the walls. More on the roof where heat rises and tries to escape. In the coldest months, an outer layer of canvas goes over the felt to block wind and moisture. The result is a thermal envelope several inches thick, wrapped completely around the interior space. Inside, the temperature differential is staggering. Outside, -30°C. Inside, with a small fire burning in the central stove, 15, sometimes 20 degrees above zero. A 50-degree difference maintained by nothing but wool, air, and geometry. The felt doesn't generate heat, it holds it. Once warmth enters the gyr, it stays there, radiating back from the walls, trapped by the insulating barrier, circulating through the enclosed air. The tuno, the roof ring, is more than a structural element. It's a chimney, a window, and a pressure release. Smoke from the central stove rises through it. Daylight enters through it, and critically, it allows moisture to escape. Humans exhale water vapor. Cooking produces steam. Without ventilation, that moisture condenses on cold surfaces, walls, ceiling, belongings, creating dampness that destroys insulation and breeds cold. The tonneau lets the gyr breathe. Hot, moist air rises and exits. Dry, fresh air seeps in through the felt and the doorway, pulled by the pressure differential. The interior stays warm and, just as important, dry. The floor is earth, sometimes covered with thick rugs or more felt. Cold, yes, but less cold than outside and easily managed with insulated boots. The walls are lined with wooden storage chests, rolled bedding, hanging textiles. Every object adds another layer of thermal mass, another buffer between the living space and the exterior. The central stove, a small iron cylinder, sits directly in the middle. Not against a wall, not in a corner, dead center. Heat radiates evenly in all directions. This isn't a tent, it's a passive thermal machine. Every element, shape, material, placement, ventilation, works together to do one thing: create a warm microclimate in a place where warmth should be impossible. The gyr doesn't fight the steppe. It creates a separate world inside it, a pocket of controlled environment where a family can sleep, eat, and live through months of cold that would kill them in hours outside. But insulation is only half the system. Felt can trap heat, but it can't create it. For that, the Mongols needed fire, and fire needs fuel. The fuel was everywhere, scattered across summer pastures in flat, sun-baked discs, piled in dried mounds near water sources where herds congregated, dotting the landscape in such abundance that collecting it wasn't scavenging, it was harvesting. Argal, dried animal dung. To a modern mind, this registers as desperation, the stuff of last resort, something burned only when nothing else remains. But that view imports assumptions that don't apply here. On the steppe, Argal wasn't a substitute for wood. It was the primary fuel source, used not because trees were scarce, but because dung was superior for the specific demands of winter survival in a felt-insulated gyr. The science explains why. Wood burns hot and fast. It combusts with open flame, releasing energy rapidly in intense bursts. In a stone fireplace or a well-ventilated cabin, that works. The mass of the structure absorbs excess heat. But in a gyr, a small, enclosed, felt-wrapped space, a wood fire would spike the interior temperature violently, making the air stifling, then crash as the fuel consumed itself. The cycle would repeat. Too hot, then too cold, then frantic refueling. It's thermally inefficient and requires constant attention through the night. Argal burns differently. Once dried completely, a process that takes weeks in the arid steppe summer, dung becomes nearly pure compressed grass fiber. The animals are intermediaries, biological processors that convert rough prairie vegetation into dense, uniform fuel. When ignited, Argal doesn't produce flame, it smolders. The combustion is slow, low temperature, radiant. A bed of glowing dung in the central stove releases heat steadily for hours, sometimes through an entire night, without tending. No flare-ups, no temperature swings, just constant, manageable warmth that the felt walls hold and distribute evenly. And critically, it produces almost no odor. The volatile compounds that make fresh manure pungent evaporate during shikon, the drying process. What remains is essentially odorless when burned, a fact that surprises anyone encountering it for the first time. The interior of a gyr heated by Argal smells faintly of smoke, sometimes of cooked food, but not of waste. The fuel source also solved a logistics problem that wood never could: portability and storage. A winter's supply of firewood is measured in cords, stacks several feet high, many feet long, immensely heavy. Transporting that on horseback or by cart, then moving it every time the camp relocated, would be impossible. But Argal is light when dried, stackable, compact. Families collected it during the warmer months, when herds ranged widely and dung was abundant and dry. Children gathered it, women gathered it. It was stacked in neat piles beside the gyr or loaded into sacks and stored on carts. A winter's fuel supply could be moved with the household, always available, never tethering the family to a single location. The collection itself was sustainable by design. The herds produced fuel continuously as a byproduct of grazing. More animals meant more dung. The system was self-renewing, limited only by the size of the herd and the labor available to gather and dry the material. There was no depletion, no resource exhaustion. The grassland fed the animals fed the people and produced the fuel. The cycle closed perfectly. This wasn't primitive. It was elegant, a fuel source that required no tools to harvest, no processing beyond sun drying, no transportation infrastructure, and that performed better for the specific application than the material it replaced. Argal was the thermal heart of the gear, the steady ember that turned felt insulation into genuine warmth. But even the best fuel and the best shelter don't guarantee survival alone. The Mongols understood that winter on the steppe wasn't a problem solved by a single innovation. It was a system. And every other element of their life, where they camped, what they wore, how they used their animals, fed into that system. The ger and the fire were the core. But survival required more than a warm center. It required reading the land, using the herd, and treating the body itself as part of the insulation system. Camp placement wasn't random. It was topography translated into strategy. The steppe looks flat from a distance, but it isn't. Subtle variations in elevation, gentle swales, low ridges, the curve of a hillside, create microclimates that mean the difference between tolerable and lethal. Wind flows like water, following the path of least resistance, accelerating through gaps, pooling in depressions. A camp placed on open ground faces the full force of the wind. A camp placed in the lee of a hill, tucked into a south-facing fold where the slope breaks the airstream, sits in relative calm. Mongol herders were master readers of these variations. They chose winter sites, called otor, with extreme care, shallow valleys that funneled wind overhead, hillsides that caught southern sun, while blocking northern gales, areas near rock outcroppings that radiated stored heat after sunset. The knowledge was passed down, refined over generations. Certain places were returned to year after year because they worked, because the wind patterns, the sun exposure, the drainage, the access to winter pasture all aligned. The landscape itself became infrastructure, not modified, not built upon, but understood and used. The livestock weren't just a food source. They were thermal mass, windbreak, and fuel factory all at once. Sheep, goats, cattle, horses, camels, every animal served multiple functions simultaneously. Their wool became felt, their dung became fuel. Their meat and milk sustained the family through months when nothing grew. But in the depth of winter, they also served as living insulation. Herds were kept close to camp, sometimes encircling the gers during blizzards. Their bodies blocked wind. Their collective warmth raised the ambient temperature of the camp perimeter. 1,000 sheep pressed together generate significant heat, and that heat doesn't vanish. It spreads, it radiates. It reduces the thermal gradient between shelter and surroundings. The animals weren't separate from the survival system. They were the system. Every jeer, every fire, every piece of clothing depended on them. Losing the herd didn't just mean losing food. It meant losing fuel, insulation, transportation, and the living barrier that made winter camp survivable. Clothing extended the same logic that governed the G-year. Trap air, layer materials, cover everything. The deal, the traditional Mongol robe, is cut long and wraps across the body, secured with a sash. Made of wool or thick cotton, often lined with sheepskin or fur, it creates multiple layers of trapped air between the fabric and the skin. Sleeves extend past the hands. The hem falls below the knee. In extreme cold, a second deal was worn over the first, then an outer coat of heavier hide or felt. Boots were tall, thick-soled, insulated with felt or fur. The feet, in constant contact with frozen ground, lost heat faster than any other part of the body. Proper boots weren't a comfort. They were survival equipment. Hats covered the ears completely, often lined with fur, sometimes with flaps that tied under the chin. Hands were wrapped or mittened, Every inch of exposed skin was a liability. The principle was identical to the GR: create a boundary, trap air, hold warmth. The body generated heat continuously through metabolism. Clothing didn't need to add heat. It just needed to prevent it from escaping. Layering worked better than a single thick garment because the air gaps between layers added insulation without adding much weight. A person dressed this way, moving between the gyr and the herd, could function outside for extended periods, even in extreme cold. Not comfortably, the steppe winter was never comfortable, but survivably. The clothing was a portable microclimate, second skin that buffered the body from an environment that would otherwise strip heat faster than it could be generated. Every element reinforced the others. The gyr held the fire's heat. The fire burned fuel the herd produced. The herd grazed pasture the landscape provided. Clothing extended the warmth beyond the gyr's walls. Camp placement reduced the wind that would otherwise steal that warmth. Nothing was isolated. Nothing was single purpose. It was a system, and systems don't fail at one point. They fail when multiple points break simultaneously. The Mongols built redundancy into everything, not through surplus, but through integration. If one element weakened, others compensated. The whole was far more resilient than any part. This way of life created a particular kind of person. The steppe winter didn't permit carelessness. It didn't forgive mistakes. Every action in autumn carried weight through the months ahead. Argal gathered in September became February's warmth. Felt inspected and repaired in October kept January's wind outside. A campsite chosen poorly in November meant suffering until spring. Survival required foresight, measured in seasons, not days, not weeks. Every decision existed in relationship to future need, future cold, future scarcity. Children learned this. It wasn't taught as abstraction, it was lived. A 5-year-old collecting dung understood that the dried paddy in their hands would become heat when the ground froze solid. The connection between summer work and winter survival was direct, visible, undeniable. This created a culture of preparation, of treating nothing as waste. Wool scraps became patches. Worn felt was layered under new. Broken tools were repaired, not discarded, because replacement might be impossible until spring. Every material object had value that extended beyond its immediate function. It also created communalism born of necessity. A family alone on the steppe faced impossible odds, but families clustered in winter camps shared labor, shared knowledge, shared resources when catastrophe struck. A neighbor's herd scattered in a blizzard became everyone's problem, because that family's survival depended on recovering those animals. A gyr damaged by wind was repaired collectively, because allowing one family to freeze weakened the whole group. The harsh environment didn't just shape tools and techniques, it shaped social structures. Mutual aid wasn't charity, it was infrastructure. And this system, refined over centuries, didn't vanish. Across Mongolia and the Central Asian steppe today, nomadic herders still live in gyrs, still burn Argal, still move their camps with the seasons, reading the same landscape their ancestors read, responding to the same wind and cold. The felt is sometimes supplemented with modern insulation. The stoves are manufactured iron instead of hand-forged. Solar panels occasionally appear on gyr roofs, powering a light or a radio. But the fundamentals remain. The circular structure, the layered insulation, the dried dung stacked beside the door, the careful selection of winter ground, the reliance on livestock for nearly everything. This persistence isn't nostalgia, it's evidence. These methods survive because they work, because they're adapted so precisely to the environment that modern alternatives often perform worse. A wooden house requires lumber transported across vast distances, requires foundation excavation into frozen ground, requires fixed location that makes following pasture impossible. A gyr can be assembled in 2 hours, moved in 3, and costs a fraction as much. The steppe hasn't changed. The wind still blows. The temperature still plunges. Trees are still scarce, and so the old solutions remain valid, not as museum pieces, but as living technology still performing the function it was designed for. The Mongol survival system was never about conquering the cold. It was about understanding it, about observing what the environment provided and what it withheld. then building a life within those constraints. The steppe gave grass, grass-fed animals. Animals gave wool, dung, meat, warmth. Wool became felt. Felt became shelter. Dung became fire. Every piece fit. Nothing was forced. The system worked with the environment's rhythms, not against them. On the frozen steppe, the greatest warmth came not from any flame, but from the clarity of that understanding. The Mongols didn't conquer winter. They listened to it. The steppe gave grass, animals, wind, cold. They built a circle of felt, burned what the herds left behind, and survived not through force but through integration. Every element served multiple purposes. Every choice connected to the next. It was a system so perfectly calibrated to its world that centuries later, it still works. On the treeless plain, the real fire was understanding itself.